Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be looking at Parsha Vaera, not to be confused with Parsha Vaera. That's all the way in the book of Genesis. But this Parsha is the second Parsha or Torah portion in the book of Shemot. And it's a lot of discussion about the plagues, the 10 plagues of Egypt. It's the first 7 that are discussed. So there's a lot of exciting things that can be talked about, but I actually don't want to talk about those just yet. I want to talk about the very beginning of the Torah portion together with you all tonight. So I put the document as per usual in the chat. I'm also, as per usual, going to share my screen. And I'm excited to look at this with you all. And also, of course, as usual, we're going to read together, but also hopefully discuss together, which would be really fun. Okay. Gonna collect. Sorry, just having some trouble with that. Okay. Awesome. All right. So first we're going to be looking at the beginning of the Parsha. I'm going to read for us in Hebrew, and then we can discuss a bit what we think is going on, and then we'll move on to the Gemara source. Also, let me know if the sound is a little bit wonky, just because I'm in a different room than usual. So feel free to text me if that's the case. Okay. So this is in the 6th chapter of Shemot, the book of Exodus, verses 3 to 9. And it goes like this. Vaera el Abraham, el Yitzchak ve'el Yaakov, be'el Shaddai, u'shmi Adonai lo nodati lahem. So this is God talking to Moshe. This is after, for like context, is all the way to the end of the last portion. Moses approaches Pharaoh for the first time to ask for freedom. And Pharaoh says, absolutely not. Not only that, but I'm going to double your workload. And it seems like Bnei Israel are very angry at Moshe. They go like, why'd you do this to us? You actually made our lives much more difficult. So here at the beginning of this parsha, we have God kind of introducing what God is up to once again, and kind of reaffirming the mission of what is supposed to be happening here. Okay, so this is what's happening. And God says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 3 patriarchs, in the name El Shaddai. And but the name Adonai, I did not give to them. It's interesting. Like God has many different names. And what God is saying here is that the patriarchs got to see one kind of name. But now that Bnei Israel, the Israelites, are going to be God's nations, they get a totally different name of God to get to know. V'gam hakimoti et briti itam latet lahem et eretz Canaan et eretz migurehem asher garuba. So God says also, I've established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned, which they lived as sojourners. So this is interesting. If you look at here, it says that God established a covenant with them. It seems that maybe like a typical literal meaning, this means with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because that's who God made the covenant with. But it's specifically to make sure that their descendants can live in the land of Israel. So it's a little interesting, like it's a little bit ambiguous, the them here, and that's eventually what the Gemara is going to pick up on later on. There's going to be a whole new understanding of what's going on there. But for now, just notice that it seems pretty straightforward that it's God saying that God's going to fulfill the promise he gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that we're going to return to the land of Israel. But it's ambiguous enough that maybe the rabbis get to do something fun with it. Okay, verse number 5. וגם אני שמעתי את נאקת בני ישראל אשר מצרים מעבדים אותם ואזכור את בריתי. And also, I heard the cry of Bnei Israel that are in Egypt working as slaves, and I remembered my covenant. As in, I remember I'm going to free them from slavery. They're not going to be in this forever. לכן, אמור לבני ישראל, אני אדוני והוצאתי אתכם מתחת סבלות מצרים, והצלתי אתכם מעבודתם וגאלתי אתכם בזרוע נטויה ובשבטים גדולים. Therefore, say to Bnei Israel, I am God. So that in case Bnei Israel are a little confused, Moshe, who are you? Where'd you come from? Tell them, God, I am God, and I am going to take you out of Egypt, from the suffering in Egypt, and I'm going to save you from slavery, and I'm going to redeem you with a strong arm and with great wonders. Okay. ולקחתי אתכם לי לעם והייתי לכם לאלוהים, וידעתם כי אני אדוני אלוהיכם המוציא אתכם מתחת סבלות מצרים. And I will take you, Bnei Israel, for a nation, and I'm going to be your God. And you will know that I am your God, who is taking you out from slavery. And then verse 8, Veheviti etchem el haaretz, asher nasati et yadi latet ota le'Avraham, Yitzchak, u'Yaakov, v'natati otam lachem morasha ani Adonai. And I will bring you to the land that I have carried you to, that I promised to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and I'll give it to you to be a kind of heritage. I am your God. So God has just promised all of these things. You might even recognize some of these things. They're like these 4 phrases from the Passover Seder that we talk about that are actually from this very section. Vehitzalti, Vegalti, Velakachti, Veheveti, kind of representing the different stages of redemption. So this is what Moshe is supposed to say to Bnei Israel, and this is what God has charged Moshe to share. But Moshe shares with all Bnei Israel, and they don't listen because they're frustrated. Imagine coming after a long work day, your temper is short. So all the more so after a long day of work, Bnei Israel are very upset and do not want to listen and probably don't have faith, which is fair to understand after so many years of slavery. So before we move on to the Tanakh to the Gemara sources, I'm curious if people have any reactions. This is like not such a, I guess like a movie worthy kind of scene that would be like in the Prince of Egypt or anything like that. It's a little more boring. But is there something here that you think is like maybe worth noting or to point out that's significant? I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts. Awesome. Yeah. Barry, we'll start with you. And please, if anyone has anything else to share, feel free to raise your hand or speak afterward.
Please do that. And Sophia's kind invitation, I will wait until somebody else wants to go first. All right, I'll chime in. Thank you. A few things going on here for me. The phrase that starts off the first pasuk of the Parsha seems to be God identifying himself to Moshe in a way that God thinks Moshe thinks is different from the way God was known in Breshit. And I see the point. I see the context, but I think we saw somewhere in Breshit, and now we're seeing it now, that reminds me of that earlier passage or earlier comment or something that I can't identify where exactly it's from, but I know I saw something somewhere with an educator such as my respected Sofia, that the name of God was known, but it wasn't performed. El Shaddai is supposed to be this kind of strength, this kind of strong God that can deliver promise and reward. He can deliver on promises, he can reward, he can punish. But God hasn't delivered on his promise yet. We've gone a whole book, and we've gone from the covenant between the parts to the covenant with Yitzchak to the covenant with Yaakov, and God hasn't delivered yet. So that the name that God is referring to, El Shaddai, is something that the forefathers knew him, loved him, and dreaded him, but they haven't seen the deliverer. They haven't seen the reward maker who says he is a God who rewards. They haven't seen that yet. So that's one thing. The name was there, but it wasn't embraced. It wasn't made known to the world. It was known. I think it was known to the forefathers, but not known to the world because there was no performance yet. And also, Moshe, this modest man amongst men, this great humble character, has been a little bit harsh with his God and his charge. God, you sent me to these people. Why do you act harshly with them? Why aren't you delivering? You just made it harder for them. So Moshe kind of deflects the result back to God, as if to say they're not listening to me, and it's obvious and why. And you're not delivering, God. You're not backing me up on my charge. You're leaving me out. The phrase I learned was, you're leaving me with the responsibility, but no teeth to do it. I can't go before Pharaoh and make it happen. You said you'd be with me. And that's the other thing. God warned Moshe before Moshe set foot back in Mitzrayim on this return journey after he had fled to Midian, that God would support the Israelis, the Hebrews. He would deliver us from freedom to freedom. He would judge the gods and people of Egypt, and it would come after the signs and the wonders and whatnot. And God, I think, made it clear to them when I read the Parsha beginning this time. Not the first time I read it. It suddenly dawned on me. Yeah, Moshe had warning about this. Why he didn't remark that to the people and say, "Hey, bear with us. God has some work to do, and we are His agents. You got to stick with me in this process. It's not going to be an in and out. It's going to be a process." And something's missing here. Moshe gets a little bit nervous about his mission here, and that's consistent with his meekness. But then that part in the middle where he says, "Why have you done harshly with my people?" is critical, where Moshe is uncharacteristically critical. I didn't see that coming when I first saw it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that these are great points, like the focus on this God's name being chosen and like being exposed to Bnei Israel now as opposed to the forefathers. The idea that Moshe was warned about this, and yet he's still kind of wary that he's gonna have to like prove to Bnei Israel that he is truly the savior. I think what's important here is that this text like doesn't seem, I think at first glance doesn't seem particularly significant, somewhat repetitive, right? We've encountered the patriarchs before. We know that this is what God promises, and like it seems like this is just a helpful piece of text to show and remind Moshe like what the charge is. Does anyone else have anything else they want to say before we move on?
Yes, this is Marilyn. It's not about
Hi.
the text. I find that I'm hearing an echo when you're speaking. Are you too close to the microphone or something?
I'll mute myself so that you can Is that better? Go for it, Marilyn.
Yeah, a little bit. That's all I had to say. Nothing about the text yet.
Oh, the echo. Oh, thank you. Okay. That's good to know. I'll move to a different part of the room. Maybe it'll be a little bit better. Okay. So here we go. Hopefully this will be a little bit better now. All right. So now that we've seen the Tanakh sources, I want to take a look at the Gemara sources. And what I think is very interesting about the Gemara sources is that I think we're going to be a little bit surprised how this is going to turn out. I'm not going to share just yet what this turns into, but I would recommend hang on to your, hold on, buckle your seatbelts. We're going to go in for a bit of a wild ride and see how these psukim turn into something totally different within the context of the Gemara. So the Gemara source that we're going to be looking at is Masechet Sanhedrin. We've encountered Masechet Sanhedrin before. Masechet Sanhedrin is a collection of a tractate of like collection of ideas about how the court should be run. And then since they're discussing the different kinds of capital punishment, they start discussing who deserves capital punishment or who's not going to be going to the world to come. And the last chapter, Perek Chelek, that's what it's called. These are the people who do not have a chelek or a portion in Olam Haba, in the world to come. And it starts listing all the different kinds of heresy that can come into this, which is pretty extreme. I think we've even encountered this before. I don't even remember which Parsha class. I think it might be not our first time. But our section of the Parsha does start talking about, is used as a way to prove something, which is what we're going to discuss.
Yeah, I think during the Tower of Babel.
Oh, yes. Yes, thank you. Yeah, during the Tower of Babel. Thank you. Wow, we should have some Parsha bingo trivia or something. So thank you. So yeah, we're back to this source. It's really fascinating. I'm going to start us off with the Mishnah, which is the Tannaitic like kind of code part of when we're learning Talmud, and then the Gemara is the commentary on that. So first we're going to start with this general principle from the Mishnah. I'm going to read it in English for the sake of simplicity. Okay, the Mishnah. All the Jewish people, even sinners and those who are liable to be executed with a court-imposed death penalty, have a share in the world to come, as it's stated, and your people shall also be all righteous, and they shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, for my name to be glorified. So built in within like the theology of Judaism, there's an idea that when people die, that there's this idea of the world to come. I guess it's our idea of like somewhat similar to heaven and hell. It's definitely more complicated than that. And there's lots to be said about that, different ideas about what that actually means. Different rabbis who throughout the centuries think is that, a helpful point to like kind of help people choose the right path, because they think there's incentive to choose the right path. Is that really what it's like after we die? But for the sake of the Mishnah, we'll just kind of go with it. And if you're interested in learning much more, I'd be happy to follow up on email and discuss with you what interesting sources there are about the world to come. But the Mishnah is saying, since we've just been listing all these examples of capital punishment, that even when you have capital punishment, you still go to the world to come. And the idea is from this pasuk from Yeshayahu, there's a sense that all of us are righteous, all of us will come from God, so we'll go to the world to come. However, there are going to be some exceptions. And these are the exceptions to the people who are not going to go, and the people who have no share in the world to come, even when they fulfilled many mitzvot. So these are the people that even if they have a lot of mitzvot, a lot of commandments that they've done that are good, they're still not going to get a portion, which suggests that what they're doing is very serious. What are they? One who says there is no resurrection of the dead derived from the Torah, and one who says the Torah did not originate from heaven, and an apikoros, who treats Torah scholars and the Torah that they teach with contempt. So these are some very interesting categories. First is this focus on the resurrection of the dead. This is an eschatological idea. Eschatology is the study of what is to come at the end of days. And built in Jewish theology, there's this idea of the resurrection of the dead. You might be familiar with the story from Ezekiel of the resurrection of the dry bones. When Ezekiel is in exile, we're not sure when we're going to turn next to Israel and come out of exile. There's this vision that Ezekiel has of these bones that are dead that then come back to life. So that's an idea of resurrection of the dead. But what's fascinating about this is the person who is a non-believer enough that they don't go to the world to come is someone who says there's no resurrection of the dead, even from the Torah, not just from Ezekiel, which is a book from the prophets, but even from the Torah. So we're going to have to figure out like where exactly in the Torah does it say thou shalt believe in resurrection of the dead? That's not an explicit verse anywhere. So we're going to have to figure out what exactly they're talking about. Another verse that says another person who believes that the Torah did not originate from heaven. So the idea that the Torah this could come in a lot of different flavors. Some people think that's if you think it's written by men and not God, if you think that there's nothing divine about it. Again, lots of ink has been spilt on this in particular, especially after the Enlightenment, when there were more and more Jews who were thinking about multiple authorship. This was like different theories outside of the Jewish context about like who wrote the Torah. And so then a lot of discussion was to be had about like who exactly counts as a heretic or not, depending on what they believe. And it's, as usual, more gray than black and white. And an apikoros, which for those of you who might be familiar with Greek in the room, you might recognize like Epicurean philosophy. This was the time period of the Tanaim. They were like aware of Greco-Roman ideas. And so someone who kind of has that lifestyle of that kind of philosopher, it's much more hedonistic, but that became the term that was used to be coined any kind of heretic, someone who not only challenged the Torah, but like seemed to make fun of it and disgrace it in public. So these are the people that do not have a share in the world to come. It's a very intense statement to say. I feel it feels hard to me because I know some very lovely people in my life who do not necessarily believe these things, and I think that they're just fine and good people. But it seems that regardless of, what do we actually think happens to these people is that they really don't get a share in the world to come. The mission is telling us that there's something that is problematic about what they believe. So yeah, I'm curious, do people have any thoughts about why these things in particular, why are they so integral to what being a Jew is all about according to the Mishnaic text? Or maybe you disagree and you're confused why some of these things would be focused. I'm curious how people would react.
I'll wait my turn.
Anyone else want to share before Barry goes?
I'll wait my turn. Join in, anybody.
I'm sorry, this is Audrey. Are we looking at Sanhedrin 90A15?
Yes. Yeah, that's what we're looking at.
Okay. Just, projecting from my employment, is this like top-down management where we're saying that, in order for things to work, we need things to be command and control. Is that where we are? We're not in a questioning, analyzing era. We really need everybody to fall into line and just at least publicly and in their personal lives say that they believe what we're saying they should believe. Otherwise, no world to come.
I really like that approach, because I think you're picking up on two ways we could read it. One is almost like an authoritative or authoritarian approach of like, well, if we're doing Judaism, you have to believe it's all true, and so therefore you must like submit to believe these things. But then you also bring up a more pragmatic point, which is that actually for this to function on a societal level, we kind of need to buy into it, almost like a kind of social contract. I can have lots of problems with how like American society functions, and I can critique it. But if I were saying, actually, I like don't believe in it altogether, that would lead to kind of anarchy. So there might be a benefit of like, even if these things often require a lot of nuance, if we were going around in public explaining, oh, we don't actually like care about Torah, we don't think it's real, then what exactly are we doing in our Jewish lives? Yeah, so thank you, Audrey. I'm just seeing what Nina wrote in the group. When Moses told Israel not to consult with familiar spirits, did he mean there is life after death? That's a great question, right? Like when there's a discussion about like not talking to ghosts or anything of that ilk, that's more magical. What was Moshe talking about? And that might seem antithetical to this, right? Because it's saying like, oh, we really believe in resurrection of the dead, but I can't believe in a ghost. Like, what's the difference between those things? There's a great debate between Rambam and Ramban on this, Maimonides and Nachmanides, where they discuss is that when Moses says not to consult with them, is he saying because they're not real? That's what Maimonides would say. He's the rationalist, right? So he thinks that, well, of course these ghosts don't exist, so like that's why you can't consult with them. The Ramban says, actually, they do exist and you should choose not to tap into them because they're much more deterministic, don't believe in idea of free will, of change, and that's something that's very important to us within the Jewish tradition. But that aside, I think that this is a great question, like what's the difference between resurrection of the dead and a ghost? I think aside from that, like more Rishonim or medieval debate, resurrection of the dead seems like something that happens only when the Messiah comes, as opposed to something that we do right now. But even that doesn't feel like a sufficient answer for you, Bina. I think that like it's a great question of like what exactly were people believing, and what voodoo was like a part of their lives is a great question. So thank you for pointing that out. And I wish I had a clear answer for you, but as often it's quite complicated. Yeah, Barry, go for it. And then if anyone else wants to share, please do.
Yeah, I'll sidestep the magic other than to say that we see it graphically when Shaul HaMelech tries to consult Shmuel in Tanakh.
Yes, as Mina just
I don't
pointed
know
out
if it's in
the
Shmuel Beit or whatever
point.
it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not looking at the chat. If anybody put that in there, Mazel, Yashikov, I'm good with you. It occurred to me as the conversation was going, as you were presenting, Sophia, that was one case. But I think if it's not stated outright, and I can't pin my mind on a specific Parsha or pursuit, it's certainly implied at the end of Reshit when Yaakov Avinu dies and wants to be buried in the land. I mean, he makes Yosef this viceroy of Egypt, prince or king, if you will, put his hand under his thigh, which is the value. That's how they made covenants those days, because of the value of the Brit Milah, and says, "Don't bury me here. You bury me at home in the cave where my forefathers are." And then Yosef, when he's on his deathbed, he makes his brothers promise, "Pakod Yivkod, there's going to be this special providence, and take me with you. Find me, take me with you." And there's a code that Moshe has to bring up the sarcophagus from the Nile or wherever it's been deposited, and carry it. Not only Yosef's carcass, excuse me, wrong word. Not only Yosef's coffin, but those of his generation, his brothers, his brethren. Honestly, I don't know. Conspicuously absent is the girls, like whoever might have been the girls of the family as well. There's stories about that I'm not advancing as believed, other than there's an idea out there, and it's missing that they came with us. But it's definitely commented by Rashi that all the boys went home with Bnei Israel. So that's crying to me to say, if it's not clear to you, at least deduce it, Barry. Wake up, I'm going home. If I'm going to what has been promised to be our home, it means something that we should be there. So it's implied to me in Torah. I can't pin down this specific pasuk that it says Lichayat Hamitim, but it's got to be there somewhere. But it certainly is implied in the Yosef promise.
So just to clarify what you're saying, Barry, you're saying that that when the patriarchs hope to return and when Yosef hopes to return, it can't just be their bodies. There's something more beautiful about the idea that it's also their souls returning as well. Is that what you're saying?
And vice versa. It's the soul and the body are somehow a connection. Because if it was just the soul, Yosef wouldn't have cared where his body was. Yaakov Avinu wouldn't have cared where his body was. If when God takes the neshama, then what is it about the body that needs to be there? And yet, take me home, bury me with my forefathers. Take me home, bury me at home. There's a reason for that. So I have to deduce it, even if I don't know the reason. Even if I don't read Yosef's mind and Yaakov Avinu's mind, there has to be a reason. These were our brilliant leaders. Not perfect, but brilliant.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to share before we move on to the rest of the Gemara sources? Okay, let's hop to it. So you might think, how are we even going to begin connecting our Parsha to this? But the Gemara is going to be doing just that. All right, I'm going to continue now. Sanhedrin 90b, and I'm going to read in the Hebrew, in the English, for us as well. Rabbi Yochanan says, from where is the resurrection of the dead derived from the Torah? So before we even continue, this is a typical Gemara fashion, right? Saying, okay, where is this idea derived from in the Torah? What's so funny, though, is that in the Mishnah, we just said anyone who questions that it comes from the Torah is like totally written off and not a part of the world to come. And then Rabbi Yochanan goes, wait a minute, what came that? What am I supposed to believe? Which I think is quite funny and like says a lot of nice things, I think, about the list, that the list might seem very punitive and black and white, but even Rabbi Yochanan, who was an incredibly knowledgeable rabbi, didn't actually understand how best to fulfill this and needed to know what sources there were. So I think that's a little bit comforting for those of us who might be scared if we make the good or the bad list, that even Rabbi Yochanan wasn't sure exactly what sources were necessary to derive resurrection of the dead from the Torah. So what does he say? Is it derived from this verse, as it's stated with regard to Truma of the tithe? So they're quoting a verse that has to do with Truma of the tithe, which is a donation of your own, or tithing of your own produce that would go to the Kohen, or the priest. And it says, and you shall give the Truma of the Lord to Aaron the priest. Okay, that is like a typical verse where it's explaining what you do with that extra tithe. You give it to the priests. And does Aaron exist forever so that one can fulfill the mitzvah by giving him the Truma of the tithe? So what they're doing here is they're saying, we understand that the priestly family is from Aaron. So when you read this verse and it says, give the tithe to Aaron the priest, it's very easy for us, like especially now since Aaron is like not alive in this moment, and the only way we relate to Kohanim in our lives is seeing them in synagogue and on holidays, like doing the priestly blessing. But the problem that the text seems to be having here is that the verse says, you shall give Truma to Aaron. For us, it seems clear you translate automatically as you just give it to the priests that are like in your life. But they're saying, wait a minute, you have to give it to actual Aaron, not just the priestly tribe from Aaron, but Aaron himself. But is it not so that Aaron did not enter Eretz Yisrael, the only place where the people could give him Truva? So this is also an integral detail. The tithing would only happen in the land of Israel. And Aaron, along with Miriam, Moses, all those leaders at that time, died before they could enter the land. So how could this commandment about tithing that only applies in Israel be about giving it to Aaron, who's never going to show up there? Okay, interesting conundrum. Rather, the verse teaches that Aaron is destined to live in the future and the Jewish people will give him Truma. From here, it is derived that the resurrection of the dead is from the Torah. Okay, so what do they understand from here? The problem is that the commandment was to give Aaron the tithe, but the tithe can only happen in Israel, and Aaron never shows up there. He dies before then. problem solved. He's going to be resurrected and show up in the land of Israel one day, and that's how you'll give him the tithe. That's an interesting solution to the problem. It seems that would be much easier to say is that Aaron's descendants will be there. But yet the way that Rabbi Yochanan is understanding this verse is he's saying, actually, Aaron himself is going to be resurrected one day. And so by the verse saying, giving the truma to Aaron the priest, it's suggesting that Aaron himself will be there one day and resurrected. And therefore now we have a source from the Torah that we are able to derive that resurrection is going to occur. Personally, I feel like this is a lot of gymnastics to answer a question that like would be very easy to solve. If we just said we don't literally mean Aaron. It's so often throughout Torah texts that we don't take verses at face value and we're able to interpret them. And it seems much easier to me, like even from an Occam's razor standpoint, right? It's a philosophical idea that like the shortest, easiest argument to understand is definitely the better one. It's much easier to me to just say Aaron doesn't really mean Aaron than to say Aaron actually means Aaron and we're reviving him from the dead. But that's what this verse does. Okay, fascinating. Now we get to our Parsha. And then we'll get to some thoughts and reactions. It is Tana Braita that Rabbi Simai says. So now we have a different Tanaitic source that asks a similar question that Rabbi Yochanan did. From where is the resurrection of the dead derived from the Torah? How do we know that resurrection of the dead comes from a verse in the Torah? It is derived from a verse as it is stated with regard to the patriarchs. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. So this verse, we saw this all the way at the beginning of our Parsha class. This is what God is telling Moshe. And God says, I made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I said that we should return to the land of Canaan. And you might remember that we pointed out this ambiguous them. And this is what they're jumping on. And we're going to see more how so. The phrase, to give to you the land of Canaan, is not stated, as the meaning of the verse is not that God fulfilled the covenant with the patriarchs when he gave the land of Canaan to the children of Israel. Rather, it is stated to give to them the land of Canaan, meaning the patriarchs themselves. From here it is derived that the resurrection of the dead is from the Torah, as in the future the patriarchs will come to life and inherit the land. So their understanding, our verse, all the way back from the beginning, I'll even go all the way to the top so that we understand, because I feel like it's incredibly convoluted the way they're understanding it. They are seeing, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Is not God saying, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I promise your children will end up in this land, but that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you literally will appear back there one day. After slavery, after 400 plus years, you yourselves are going to be revived from the dead, and you're going to return to the land of Canaan. That's this ambiguous them that they're picking up on. And very similarly to the Aaron source, it feels like, again, it would just be much easier to say that means they're descendants and doesn't actually mean literally Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob or Aaron, and then we revive them from the dead. And yet these are the sources that they use in order to understand resurrection of the dead as coming from the Torah, which I think is fascinating. Does anyone have any thoughts, reactions, qualms? I find this, like I said before, to be a lot of mental gymnastics in order to get to this answer.
In my turn.
Does anyone want any clarifying questions? Also, it's a difficult passage. Or any repetition of the idea? Okay, yeah, there you go for it.
Okay, thank you. I am flashing back to the covenant between the parts. And I'm not—
Do you want to refresh for people what the covenant between the parts is?
Yes. This is the dreamlike state that God puts Abraham Avinu in at the twilight and as it gets dark. And there's supposed to be a division in pieces of certain animals to be separated half and half or part to part. And there's a ritual to it that God takes Abraham Avinu through, and this type of procedure is supposed to be God's solemn promise by his own hand, by his throne, call it what you will, but directly from God. And Moshe calls God on this along the way in the Varim, hey, God has made these promises, and God, Moshe also challenges God at that time in the Varim at certain places where appropriate, that hey, you promised them by your oath, not by this heaven and earth, not by this or that, not by things that are temporary and will eventually go away, but by your hand, your permanence. You made this promise to us. So at our moments of weakness and rebellion, when God was upset with us and Moshe was also upset with us, but Moshe is our champion in these cases. So here we are back where this started in my mind, in terms of covenant, that God is making a promise to Abraham through this procedure that's supposed to be binding upon God and us. And what I thought he said was not only that he was promising Abraham, but he was, and his seed, that Abraham and his seed, and the seed would take possession of the land, and the seed would take possession of the gates of our enemies, etc. And we would be made as numerous as the stars in the sky, the sand on the seashore, the dust of the earth. These promises are made along the way, and these are binding on God and us. Our promises, we are your avadim, we are your mouthpiece to the world. We are showing, we're going to lighten the world with your commandments and your Torah, which becomes our commandments and our Torah to do. All that starts, I think, at the covenant between the parts in Bereshit, and it's binding. But I thought it was clear to me when I read that then that it was Abraham and his seed, and that's right. One of the things that Abraham challenged even then. That Abraham said, but at that time, maybe it was Abraham at the time, that I was, I don't have seed, I don't have a child. It was pre-Yitzchak. I don't have seed. I don't have children. I have Eliezer, a Canaanite, who's gonna take over my household when I'm gone. I don't have anybody to give it to. And God says, you will have seed, and Abraham has to take a leap of trust. And he has to take a leap of trust that he will have seed and he will take land. So there's the two parts of the covenant going there. And it's all that kind of mixed together, but the seed was included in my mind. It was mentioned. And so it kind of caught me off guard what we saw a little bit differently about tithe to Aaron. I'm wondering if, and again, I didn't read the Hebrew on that part, and I'm weak in Hebrew anyway, but would it not have been logical, and what it would have been so hard to do, to say, Aaron, give the tithe to Truma to Aaron and his seed, because that's what would be the line. So I'm a little bit baffled when it doesn't say the seed, and that becomes a source evaluation by our Chachamim of yore, then that baffles me a little bit too. But I want to make a philosophical point that also gives me comfort. And I'm not telling anybody else how to believe or how to think, but the way I think of it is there's a whole difference between asking and probing and looking for a source of where something happens or where something is commanded versus believing in the topic at hand. So I think you can believe in a topic and wonder where the source was. And I don't see any rebellion in that regard. To want to know where to put your ground, because when others will certainly come along and challenge us. And one of our instincts, and one of the instincts that Satan plays on us, is knowing why we do things, knowing where it comes from. And that puts our feet on the ground and it gives us solid ground to stand on. So it's different to challenge or to look for a source versus believing in something that's said or implied. So I'm good with that kind of process.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the comfort of Rabbi Yochanan and even Rabbi Stein asking where the source is in the Torah, that if we were assuming it's like a typical dogma, the way that we talk about dogma in like a secular context, or like not, I mean, dogma is like specifically not secular, but if we're talking about dogma, like we think about Christianity, it does seem like something there isn't a space like probe and ask questions. That's cool that built in within the Gemara here, there's clearly questioning and probing. I also wonder like how self-aware the Gemara is that these are fairly weak feeling answers. Like it feels like you're really pulling teeth in order to show that resurrection is happening. And I think that's like an interesting question of self-awareness that they may or may not have had. But overall, I think very what you point out is like, it seems very easy to us and not so difficult to read a Torah text and see like, well, obviously they meant like, and their descendants. That's like part of what being in Bnei Yisrael, in the Jewish people is seeing ourselves as if we ourselves were there, and it's not just our ancestors, and then vice versa. And it seems like they're really struggling with that here in this Gemara. It's like, it's hard for them to compute that those things go together, when I think for us, it's very common for us to be thinking this way.
Can I make just one quick comment about what you just said? I'm
Sure.
I'm wondering if these guys weren't responding to questions they were getting from their own students. So that might be an instinct to say, hey, my students are asking me these questions. I got to come up with something for these guys. I can't ignore them.
Yes, an integral part of this chapter. I really recommend, like, if you ever want to feel like you want to jump into something kind of wacky, if you want to learn more about these ghosts and spirits, like Mina was talking about, like what are these issues, I really recommend checking out this last chapter of Sanhedrin. There's some wacky stuff in there. And often they talk about apikorsim, the heretics, coming and asking them questions, and often they're trying to trip them up, like asking very smart Torah questions, but they're trying to poke holes in the arguments. And then it's got the rabbis struggling with their students. It's like a really interesting dynamic going on. And maybe one can say that you're supposed to believe, like maybe what they were trying to say is that believing in resurrection of the dead is really important. And the way to say it is that there's a Torah source for it, but then the teachers go, oh, the students go, oh yeah, like show me a source. Yeah, Audrey, go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry, my headset just came undone. Is anyone else thinking about physics and Einstein and the idea of, you can, if you see a star right now, that means the light was released like millions or billions of years ago, and just like, kind of, I don't know, I'm not gonna say.
Audrey, you're fading on me.
Kind of,
Oh yeah, Audrey, I think the headpiece fell out. Maybe bring the microphone closer to you.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
At any rate, as long as we are getting comfortable with different approaches to things, was there perhaps an anticipation of science that that you have to, and I think I scrolled ahead, the linear time theory here.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's my
actually,
yeah.
At any rate, so please go on.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue, Audrey. Thank you. Okay. My takeaway for this section, I wanted an excuse to talk, share some text by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. His past yard site was last week, was his 50th yard site. Wow. I'm too young to have ever met him, but he has a huge influence, I believe, on my life. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on a lot of his work. I went to Toronto Heschel School when I was younger. And he really was an amazing figure that both knew so much text and also was really living in like the real world and like helping, walking, like marching in Selma with Martin Luther King, helping like in protests against the Vietnam War. Like he was really someone who was living out the ideals that he was reading about. And I think that he's a very impressive person. And there is a book that he wrote at the end of his life where he kind of comes up with this huge theory about Torah Shoel Peh, about the oral law. It was in Hebrew and it was translated into English very poorly. And most recently, the Hebrew has been republished, and there's a whole new section that had never been published before where he actually talks about this question we discussed earlier of Torah min hashamayim, of Torah coming from heaven. Now what's the most exciting, I think, for me is that he's someone who is a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is conservative, but this newest publication of his work is through Magid, which is a part of Koren Publishing, which is an Orthodox publication. And he's really someone who like transcended a lot of denominational boundaries, and he seems to be becoming more and more accepted and welcome within the Orthodox world. And I think that we could all learn a lot from him. So I really just wanted an excuse to talk about him, but I think that he responds to exactly what Audrey was talking about, this idea of like the star, and the star is dead, but yet we see the star now. this is really just dealing with the space-time continuum. I am not an expert in physics at all. Maybe Audrey can share more on that. But this idea of a linear time, that's not just simply past, present, and future going in a linear fashion, but especially if you're looking at it through the lens of God, those things are happening all at once constantly. This conversation kind of gets like thrown like on its head. And I think what's helpful about the sources we're about to read is that Heschel perceives history, Jewish history, in a linear way. And so in some ways, to me, it kind of minimizes the question about resurrection of the dead, because like the idea of the dead being resurrected feels less odd if the dead don't actually like die in the past, right? Like it's like this even can be connected to modern psychology, that if God forbid there's a death or a grieving in the family, okay, technically that person has passed, but they're always with you. You're always feeling them. Like the conception of time there totally kind of gets thrown out the window. And actually that's a lot of what religion is as well. Like we're not at Mamad Har Sinai physically, but the idea that we all took on the covenant at Har Sinai thousands of years ago is integral to our belief system. And that doesn't have to be like, oh, like, do I believe in physics or not? But it's more like, how much is time the way that I think about life to begin with? Like, time is important milestones, but ultimately, like, it's really about the connections that we make along the way and how they impact us. And I think that's actually quite healthy. It means that age, maybe I'm speaking as someone who's like quite young, it doesn't mean that age has to be holding me back from certain ideas or certain life experiences. It means that we can just be trying to like gain experiences and feelings, and that's what defines our lifestyle. Actually, the one potential I have before we get to the Heschel is what I think is very fascinating, is in Masechet Kiddushin, when they're discussing respecting the elderly. It says, asks why we need to respect elders. And it doesn't say because they have a lot of years, but it says they're bar harpatike. They are collections of experiences, and that's what makes them respectable. And then all the more so, like they're talking about how you have to stand for someone who is elderly. So they say that's also why you stand for a rabbi or someone else respected in your life. It's because of the experiences that they've had, not necessarily the wisdom of age that comes, but there's other ways to gain wisdom. I think that's a very fascinating way to be thinking about aging, a fascinating way to be thinking about life and what can bog us down and what can empower us. So with that charge, I would like to read some Heschel that will kind of make us think about time differently, maybe this whole question differently, and this can hopefully be an interesting takeaway for us for this class. So I'm going to read two quotes, a short one and a long one. It is clear that the intention was to determine that the understanding of Torah was entrusted to the sages. That is, the Torah was not given exclusively from the mind of God, is refracted also through the interpretation of the sages. So this is Heschel justifying the project of the oral Torah, that the rabbis are able to interpret what happened in Sinai thousands of years later. They're saying that it's not that, oh, one was in the future, one was in the past, how can they interact with each other? But that actually there's something that's like constantly re-happening that the sages are now explaining. Okay, and let's see what that is. We must distinguish between factual truths and eternal verities. Every fact depends upon time, and when its time has passed, the fact disappears. Yet there are moments that are like eternity, and what happens in them transcends time. The passage of time brings forgetfulness. The present moment makes us forget the moment past. Two moments in time cannot exist. They crowd each other out. But the opposite is the case with eternity, for there is not forgetting at the throne of glory, and for God, past and future come simultaneously. So the giving of Torah is past as a factual truth, but endures as an eternal verity. God's voice, as it emanated from Mount Horeb, was never muted. So what Heschel is saying here, let's use Mamad Har Sinai as our example. It is not something that happened 3,000 plus years ago. It's actually something that is continuously happening in every single moment. Thinking about time as past, present, and future is not helpful for us. It creates distance. But that part of joining into tradition is kind of joining into this like totally different conception of time that asks us to participate over and over again, constantly affirming and renewing our experience. I think like a really loose idea that might be more analogous is the idea of a marriage. People get married, but that's not the end of the relationship. That there's always this constant reaffirming, rededicating, rediscussing what's important within the marriage, even after the wedding day. And I think that that's a great way to recognize that time is a useful way to mark things. It's good to have a wedding anniversary. My mom just left the Zoom a few minutes ago. It was her and my dad's anniversary yesterday. So that might be why it's on the mind. But that is a helpful milestone, but that's not really what it's about. It's really about how are you constantly affirming and reliving that moment every day. And so I think that thinking about time this way kind of makes the question of Chazal thinking about resurrection of the dead not important, but maybe like less wacky, less like, wow, why are they struggling so much to bend over backward to think of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov coming to the land? But I think that if we kind of throw this conception of linear time out the window, this idea that Chazal would really want people in the past to be experiencing things in the present or in the future, that becomes integral to what tradition is. That is tradition. That's what it means to be. It's not just about believing it in past things, but it's about how the things in the past can affirm our present, and also help us think about the future. So, I mean, I don't have a physics degree. Maybe some of you do here. I don't understand exactly how that works in the space-time continuum, and it's a difficult topic. Luckily, there have been lots of movies, I think, like in the past while, have been dealing with the metaverse and like different alternative realities. I think like it's in like the cultural milieu right now. But hopefully this can at least give us some new language to be thinking about this issue, and to be maybe thankful that like the past, present, and future don't have to define us in ways that are like particularly binding. And we can be thinking, what are the moments that we are constantly living out and feeling in the present and want to resurrect, quote unquote, in our own lives. And hopefully in a maybe somewhat convoluted way, we can gain that from these sources here tonight. Does anyone have any final thoughts they want to share? Audrey, is the hands left over or new thought?
I think it's left over, but thank you. It's been, I look forward to this on Wednesday. So it's been nice to share time with all of you. And I'll try to take the hand down if I can figure it out.
Keep it up. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Sure, Barry.
I think these passages and these Chachamim are all brilliant. They're amazing people, and in this age we have both genders, both sexes being brilliant, and there's a lot of things to come that will affect that too. And this non linear time aspect, whether it's multi or juxtaposed or alternative realities or whatever. I think anything in a realm that we live in that has physicality has linearity. I'm not saying that it's all linear, but it has linearity that we have to face. And I came by explanation, by common accepted explanation, I came by my parents. And yet I think they and I and my line and my future line will hopefully embrace that our neshamot come from God. And our parents are vehicles for us, and we will be vehicles for our children, and we'll be trustees, but not possessive. My child, fine. My mother, Sofia, Mazel Tov on your parents' anniversary. My parents, my children, me. This possessiveness is figurative. It's all we're trusted. And I keep going back to Breshit, and it's never mentioned after that area in Breshit where it said about the promise that Avram and Sarai will have a child. It really comes up after that. I don't know if it ever comes up after that. But when Sarai laughs, when Abraham laughs, I read a Rashi commentary that Abraham laughed from joy that God could pick the old man who was doing what he felt was right and getting rewarded for it and getting to be the father of a child. And Abraham laughed from this kind of joy, this kind of enrichment. And Sarai was laughing from a bit of a skepticalness that Rashi comments that she's laughing because what does she say? I'm an old lady and my old man, we're supposed to have a child. And God's response was, what can't I do? Doesn't she realize? What is she laughing about? Because the way she laughed, as opposed to the way Abraham laughed. It's, what can't I do? And so here we are in God's realms, and God is in all realms at all time and lives and exists at all times simultaneously. And I have to buy into that by my nature. So I'm not telling anybody else what to believe, but I do. I buy it. God is in all realms at all times, but I can't be. I live in a linear time. I'm hoping my neshama survives. I believe what you said nailed it for me. And because I've been feeling that way for abundant years, Sophia, and class, that my parents live in me. My older brother lives in me. I've lost all three of them. And yeah, I carry them all the time. I spontaneously, things come up and I'm thinking, oh, my brother Alan would have said that or done that. My parents would have said this or that. And it's remarkable. We don't lose it. And the stars in the sky. Some of them aren't even there anymore, but some of them are, and they're billions of years later. and they're going. And it's just an amazing, amazing existence that we're part of. And it's all a blessing. I'm blessed to study with you guys. Thank you.
Amen. Any last thoughts? Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. And thank you for coming on that fun ride of a Gemara. I find it's like a little different than what we've some of the ones we've been doing the past few times. And yeah, so nice to spend a Wednesday evening with you, and hopefully see you all next week.
Thank you.
Audrey,
Right,
keep
thank
bringing
you.
up the physics, please. That's great
Yeah,
stuff.
that was a great
No,
point.
it's fun.
Great
I mean, I
stuff.
think what Sophia had mentioned, there have been some films. What was that? What movie where Matthew McConaughey was an astronaut who like spent
Interstellar.
decades in space?
Interstellar, yes.
Yeah, I thought a little bit about Interstellar, but
That's a
I
great
really like what you said, Barry, because I lost my father last
you.
year, and it's hit me
Yeah.
really hard.
I'm sorry.
And I do really feel like I signs that he's with me all the time. So
If
I
you want an ear,
appreciated
my
the
ear is
comments
yours.
that
If you ever
made.
want to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, thank
Well,
you,
that-
everyone. We'll
That'll be our
probably
final-
see you next week.
Amazing. All right,
Take
see
care.
you next week.
Okay.
What is time anyway? All right.
Right.
Bye.
About 8:30.
Have a good night.
Sorry. Yeah, Eshikov, great.